Hello, everybody. My name is Happy, and I'd like to welcome you all to my History Reaction channel. Today, we'll be taking a look at the Irish Potato Famine by Extra History. As always, I will include a link to the original content in the description down below. Please consider heading over to Extra History and showing them a little bit of appreciation if you like what you see here today. Alright, so this is a compilation. They originally released it in 5 parts. We're going to do it in 2 parts. So we're going to watch parts 1, 2, and 3 today. Those deal primarily with the famine itself. And then tomorrow we'll come back for parts 4 and 5, which deal with the aftermath of the famine primarily, especially the Irish Exodus. I have not seen this one before, but I am familiar with the Irish Potato Famine. I've done a lot of reading on it. I'm working on a historical novel set in the Irish Potato Famine during Black 47. I've been spending the last year or so just deep diving into life in Western Ireland during this famine. And I'm really excited about how the writing is going so far. So I just wanted to take a look at this, kind of refresh things in my mind as I pushed harder and harder on that. And I am a descendant of famine Irish. My ancestors from my mother's side, the Fennels and the Pendergasts, came here from Ballyadams parish in what was then Queen's County, Ireland. Family lore says 1848. I cannot find any documentation of them being here in this country until at the absolute earliest, 1851. And that one is about 90% likely to be them, but I can't be 100% sure. And that is actually a ship list of people coming over from Ireland. It has the right names and basically the right order and the right ages, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything because they are very common Irish names. Could be a pure coincidence, but I don't think so. I think what probably happened is they probably did leave in 1848. That was a big year for people leaving right after Black 47. They probably got stuck in Liverpool, most likely, for a few years because that did happen. If you couldn't afford the fare all the way, sometimes people would stop over in Liverpool or other parts of England, work there for a few years to save up for passage further away. I suspect that's what happened. But once they got here, they worked a little bit in New York, then they moved to Ohio, and not long after that, Illinois. They worked as farmhands primarily. They did actually end up doing fairly well for themselves because they ended up in Iowa owning a huge dairy farm. In fact, there is a historical site in Iowa to this day, the Fennel Barn, that actually belonged to my great-grandfather, I believe, plus or minus a great. So they went from poor famine Irish and working as farmhands to owning this huge dairy farm. I've been to the location. I've walked around their property, well, not on it, but on the roads around it to get a feel for how big it was. Pretty impressive for people who started literally with nothing. The family before it came over was much larger. Several of them died in Ireland before they ever left. I don't know for sure, but I suspect probably from the famine, based on family lore, but nothing concrete that I've been able to find. Finding records in Ireland is really hard. The censuses, for example, were destroyed in a fire for those years. Someday I want to get over to Ballyadams and try to look at some parish records, if that's possible. See if I can find them that way. There is a cemetery there that has a Fennel and Pendergast monument in it, so I suspect that's tied to my family since I come from a marriage between Fennel and Pendergast that came over. So I do want to get there someday. Anyway, I'm rambling. I do ramble a lot. So we got a long series to get through, so let's just get going.
The first thing the farmer notices is the smell. An earthy rot in the fields. The Irishman walks into his potato field to find the plants turning brown and wilting. He digs up a tuber and finds it slimy like a bar of soap. When he slices it open, brown mucus oozes out.
Not good.
The whole crop is the same. It'll be a hungry year, but he will survive. Because this isn't Ireland in the famine year of 18.
It's not. It's going to be the United States. As far as we know, that's where the blight started. Now, recent scholarship has suggested it might have started in Mexico. I haven't had an opportunity to follow up on that, so I don't know how much evidence there is or how strong that argument is. I just know that it's a fairly recent development, but it definitely was here in the United States before it reached Europe. So, yeah. And one of the important things when we're talking about the Irish potato famine is why did it hit Ireland so hard? Because it hit the United States, it hit the rest of Europe, or at least large stretches of Europe, but nowhere did it have the impact that it did in Ireland. So what made Ireland different? That is a discussion I think we all need to have and to understand, because there's a lot to learn from this.
1945. It's the United States 2 years earlier. And this man has no idea how this blight will devastate the country of his birth.
But before we continue today's historical tale, we'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons over on Patreon, who not only help make all of our videos possible, but who also vote on topics we cover, like they did with this extra history complete on the Irish Potato Famine you're watching right now. To learn how you can vote on the shows we make, click the link below.
The Irish Potato Famine ranks as one of Europe's worst agricultural disasters. An event so momentous that it not only defined a generation, it scattered a people to the winds.
Yep.
When the blight arrived in 1845, Ireland had a population of 8.2 million. Within a decade, though, a third of it was gone.
Yep.
Around 1.1 million died from starvation and disease,
while 2 million emigrated abroad. Actually, you know what? Strike that. Emigration isn't the right word.
It was flight.
It was.
Plain
They fled.
and simple. An evacuation. During the height of the famine years, when children's mouths were stained green from eating grass and dogs scavenged graveyards, people brawled on the docks for space aboard the overcrowded vessels. Most didn't even care where the ship was headed, as long as it wasn't Ireland.
Yeah, and a lot of the ships that they came over on were not passenger ships. They were coming over on merchant ships, and they were just crowded in there. It was... Some of them were called coffin ships for a good reason. They packed them in too tight because of famine. The number one killer in famine is not hunger. It's very hard to starve to death. You can do it, but it's not easy. More common, you're going to die from disease long before you die of hunger. And the Irish potato famine is no exception to that. Disease ran rampant because your body's weak and you're not getting the nutrients you need. Disease is going to kill you before the hunger does. Then you pack all these people on these ships. A lot of these ships are going to be plague ships by the time they reach the New World. Some of them are not going to be allowed to land. Others are going to be required to land in quarantine zones where people will be kept often until they die. So it's really a tragic story.
Yet Ireland was not the only country, or even the first, to experience the blight. The fungus responsible emerged in the...
Okay, I was just going to say it's not a fungus, but I see he's already correcting himself, so let's read this. P. infestans is actually a fungus-like microorganism called oomycetes, I believe is the right pronunciation, but I'm not 100% sure. But it's a water mold, just like it says here. The Victorians thought it was a fungus. There was a huge debate over that. And one reason that it took so long to deal with this blight is because the scientists were kind of being boneheaded about what it was and what it was, and kind of in denial about what it might be, which was a water mold. So there was... that helped contribute to the problems.
United States in 1843, hitching a ride to Europe in cargo holds. Farmers attempting to strengthen European potato strains may have even accidentally imported it when they crossbred their potatoes with American stock.
Yeah, so here they're mentioning Mexico. Recent research suggests that the pea infestants may have emerged in Mexico before traveling to the United States. Sorry, my tongue is kind of running away with me today. All right, let's continue.
And strengthened by a rainy summer and carried by the wind, the fungus stormed the continent. During the summer of 1845, news of the blight filled European newspapers. Belgium had lost 87% of its potato crop, Flanders 92%, Holland lost 70%.
Okay, really quick, I want to make a couple of clarifications here. So first, let's start with the one that he makes. These flags are visual aids for regions, so some are approximate or were not in use yet. So don't freak out if the flag is, oh, that's anachronistic, that didn't exist yet. That's not the point of it. Let it go. All right, continuing on. When we're looking at these numbers, they're giving like lost 80% or 90% or 70% of their potato crops. That's across the whole nation. Different regions are going to be hit to different degrees within a nation. And that might seem like common sense, but it's something we do kind of need to understand because one part of a country might be devastated. The entire crop is gone, while in another corner of the same country, it's doing just fine. So when we look at these numbers, let's not assume that everywhere within Belgium or Germany or the United States or any place else where this is hitting, that every area in that region is being hit equally. And the same thing is true of Ireland. Some areas were hit much harder than others. In particular, the south and west side of Ireland was hit much worse than the east and the north. In particular, Cork, Mayo, Galway were hit pretty hard. And of course, famously, Skibbereen was really devastated. It became kind of the unfortunate poster child of the famine.
Germany and France got off relatively light, only losing a fifth of their harvest. Rumors of starvation leaked out of Russia and Poland, while English farmers saw similar devastation. Governments prepared for a season of hunger and instability. The potato, after all, was the staple diet of Europe's emerging industrial working class. This miracle plant, imported from Peru, could produce 2 to 4 times more calories per acre than grain. Cheap and easy to prepare, it allowed Europe's shrinking agricultural sector to feed its booming manufacturing workforce. And between 1750 and 1850, the European population nearly doubled, partially due to the potato. Any threat to the potato crop was a serious problem. In fact, these crop failures would help spur the wave of revolutions that racked Europe in 1848.
Yep.
But here the story of Ireland diverges.
If you're not familiar with that, 1848 was the year of revolutions. Revolution broke out all over the place in that year.
Because while all these countries experienced economic hardship and social change, Ireland alone starved. The reasons for that are complicated, but they boil down to 2 factors. The first was a land system that made Ireland uniquely vulnerable to a crop failure. And the second factor was human. A group of British leaders governing from London who saw the famine relief as a vehicle for reforming the Irish economy and instructing the people's moral character.
Yes.
Throughout the crisis, British policymakers would make economic reform their primary objective.
Let's stop there real quick. I've done a lot of deep diving into famine. And one thing that I've read in multiple sources is that if you look at famine historically, prior to this period, or around this period, maybe a little earlier, most famines were the result of natural disasters. In other words, you had a drought or a unusually long winter, the year without a summer, for example. Things of that nature. After this, starting around this period and up to the present day, most famines we have now have a strong human component. In other words, a natural disaster can still be involved to ignite a spark, so to speak. But most modern famines, the problem tends to be more about human nature and politics than it does the actual disaster itself. In modern society, we generally have enough food that we can deal with famine if we want to. And that right there is the issue. Now, there are going to be some exceptions, but they're increasingly rare. More and more, famine is much more of a human thing than it is of a natural disaster thing. Take a look at the Holodomor, for example, or Mao's Great Leap Forward. Both of them had a natural component, but they were made far, far worse as a result of the way people reacted to the famines. Or to the conditions, I guess might be a better way to say it. Or especially in those two cases I just named, a lot of it had to do with collectivization practices, for example, or in the case of Stalin, using it as an excuse to get rid of potential political enemies, or in the case of Mao, one of the things he did, for example, was order the extermination of sparrows, which actually made things worse because the sparrows were eating the seeds. That made things worse because the sparrows were actually eating the insects, and now the insects were eating the crops, and that made things worse as well. So more and more as we get into the modern age, we see more and more of a human involvement in making things worse, or even creating the problem in the first place. If we want to avoid a natural famine, typically we can do it. It may not be a perfect solution, but if we really wanted to, we could fix most of them. We've got the ability to do that now. So when it doesn't happen, it's usually for a reason, and that reason can be traced back to government, economic models, in some cases religion, and we're going to see all that here in Ireland. So when I mentioned the Holodomor or the Great Leap Forward, and we're talking about famines that are largely influenced by socialist and communist factors, the Irish Potato Famine is made much worse. Sorry, I said my tongue was tying itself. Made much worse by early laissez-faire capitalism. Free market, don't mess with it. And that's going to cause a lot of these problems in Ireland. That's not the only factor, but that is a big part of it. And of course, in one other place where there's a human element to famine is going to be in sieges. But that's been the case for as far back as we know. When an army surrounds a city or a fortress or whatever and doesn't let food get in and out, that is also a man-made famine, but those are typically on a much smaller scale. But that is a historical example of man-made famine that's been around forever. But in the distant past, natural causes were by far and away the most common problem.
With saving lives as a distant secondary goal.
Right.
The blight indeed was, as British politicians argued, an act of God.
Yep.
Unstoppable and inevitable. The famine, by contrast, was the work of men.
Yep.
But that was still to come. In the summer of 1845, British Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel was tracking reports of blight.
I always found it ironic that the first guy that tries to deal with the Irish Potato Famine is named Peel. One of those little ironies of history.
Worried about it striking England, of course. But he knew that if it took hold in Ireland, the result would be catastrophic. Technically, Ireland had been a part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland since 1801. But in a practical sense, it had been the very first step in the British colonial empire. The English had ruled it directly or indirectly for centuries. In that time, the British Crown had gradually dispossessed native Irish Catholic families, confiscating their land and gifting it to English and Scots Protestants who were considered more reliably loyal. While Catholic countries sponsored a series of Irish revolts against the Protestant English, and tensions grew.
Yeah, and that's fairly accurate. Once the British moved into Ireland, they very much did start displacing Irish landowners, replacing them with Protestant landowners from Britain, England, and Scotland. There is a long history of Catholic countries, notably Spain in particular, and France, who are both Catholic, inciting the Irish to rebel against Britain anytime that either of those two countries got into war with Britain, or were even thinking about it. You see that, for example, it happened in the Napoleonic Wars. France is trying to stir up the Irish against the British. It happened over and over again. You see the same thing the Spanish try it as well. So everything he said there is pretty accurate. There's this long history of the British taking more and more control in Ireland and dispossessing the people and trying to suppress their culture and especially their religion. And that is going to lead to a lot of problems historically all through Ireland's history with England. And it's going to have a big impact on the potato famine because religion's going to come into this. This is, for some people, are going to view this as God's punishment to the Irish for not being proper Protestants and following a heretical faith.
The climax came when Oliver Cromwell reconquered Ireland after a rebellion, completing the process of land confiscation and totally replacing Irish landowners with English and Scots, the so-called Anglo-Irish. And it was bloody. Conservative estimates suggest that Cromwell's invasion, along with the famine it caused, may have killed 10% of the Irish population.
Let's take a look at his note here. Estimates range as high as 20%, though the lack of statistics make a specific number hard to verify.
To prevent another uprising, Cromwell and later British governments passed a series of penal laws restricting Catholic rights. Catholics could not hold public office, own firearms, or be admitted to the bar as lawyers. They couldn't own a horse worth over £5, vote, teach school, or marry a Protestant. There were restrictions on how they could own land, and when willing land to children, they couldn't give it intact to the eldest, and had to break it up equally among all their children. Churches couldn't be built of stone, and had to sit far from roads.
That part he just mentioned about the division of land between all your heirs is a big deal. Because let's say you're a farmer in Ireland, and by some stroke of luck, you still own your land. You have 100 acres. You have, say, 4 sons. So when you die, you leave each of your sons 25 acres. Or each of those sons has 2 or 3 sons each. When they die, those 2 or 3 sons are going to divide that land up. So now we're looking at like what? 7 to 10 acres per person. When they have kids and die, you see what's happening here. The plots of land are getting smaller and smaller, and a lot of the Irish peasants, the poorer Irish, are subsistence farmers. They are growing crops to feed themselves and extra in order to pay the taxes, which were often paid in crops. And that doesn't, as this land is getting smaller, it makes it harder and harder for them to do both. They've got to either pay their taxes or feed themselves, or they either lose their land or they die. It's kind of becoming increasingly a no-win scenario for them.
And they couldn't attend universities at home or abroad. And 80% of the Irish population was Catholic. These laws were designed to bar Irish Catholics from all forms of political and economic advancement. And while they were gradually repealed, the last vanishing in 1829, it would take generations for the Irish to recover economically. And on top of that, these landlords charged astronomical rent on the land, barely allowing the native Irish farmers to survive. And the whole thing took place in a system of middlemen so convoluted that... Okay, here's an analogy. Imagine someone owns an apartment building today. That's the landowner. They don't want to manage it, so they pass it off to a middle person to manage. Now the middle person wants to make a profit and knows there's a lot of demand, so they jack up the rent. And to make more profits, they subdivide some of the larger apartments into smaller ones. Now, under the pressure of making this exorbitant rent, some of the building's tenants start to get roommates or rent some of their bedrooms on Airbnb, further subdividing their own apartment. Wow, this sounds really familiar. Oh, hi, NYC. I didn't see you in this analogy. Anyway,
Yeah.
that's basically what happened to Irish farmers. In fact, some of the landowners, known as absentee landlords, hadn't even lived in Ireland for generations. The trend was bad. Then events made it worse. During the Napoleonic Wars, Irish goods suddenly became a major part of British imports, as the war cut off suppliers in France. Things improved for the Irish, with many turning to new manufacturing jobs. But then, Napoleon was defeated. French goods returned, and the burgeoning industrial sector collapsed. Out-of-work weavers and tradesmen flooded the countryside, engaging in ludicrous bidding wars for small plots of farmland, promising to pay rents the land could never sustain. Irish farmers began cultivating land that had never been farmed before: rocky hillsides, beaches, and bogs. The land, subdivided already through the inheritance laws and the greed of landowners, got subdivided further. And middlemen for those landlords, increasingly disappointed with returns from potato farmers, evicted whole villages to use the land for cattle raising, which squeezed the farmers even further. By 1841, 45% of all agricultural holdings were under 5 acres, a consequence of population explosion paired with a land system that depended on chains of landlords, often 3 or 4 deep, leading back to England. Only one thing allowed people to survive. You guessed it, the potato.
Let's take a look at what that said.
One thing allowed people to survive. You guessed it, the potato.
These potatoes were the Irish lumper variety, a particularly vulnerable strain. Got it.
A single acre of potato plants could produce 6 tons of crop per year, enough to feed a family of 6. No other crop provided such a yield. But many Irish families were larger than that, and the rent still had to be paid.
Yeah, and they would grow crops to pay the rent. That's the only way they could pay it. So they would typically grow something like oats or barley, possibly wheat in some areas, but Ireland is really not that great for growing grains. It can be done in some areas, but the climate there is not the best for that kind of growing. And what they are growing, like I said, is being given to pay their taxes, or it's being exported. So they're looking for something to sustain themselves. Potatoes are the obvious choice. It has, as he said earlier, it's got a lot of calories, it's got a lot of vitamins. It is kind of a wonder food, especially for this period. And you can grow a lot in a very small area. So you can put what little land you had, put a lot of it over to crops to pay for your rent or your taxes. And then the rest, what little's left, you can turn over to potatoes for your own food.
In the decades leading up to the famine, the shrinking plots of land gave most no more than a subsistence living. Ireland was already the poorest country in Europe. Before the subdivision, most families at least had a cow. But in the decades before the famine, the more expensive cow disappeared, replaced by a pig. Milk, butter, eggs, and herring disappeared from the peasants' diets.
Yeah, and the pig often lived in the cottages with the Irish farmers.
Cash crops like barley and oats vanished, replaced by more potatoes. Visitors were shocked at the depth of Irish poverty. The majority of the country went shoeless, and many in the countryside wore literal rags. In towns, landless workers lived by the pawn shop, pawning their Sunday clothes after attending church, buying them back on Friday payday, wearing them to church again, and then repeating the cycle. But those same visitors were often astounded by the peasants' hardiness. Irish peasants were strong and often good-looking. Scientific testing, so popular in the Victorian age, found that the average Irish peasant was both taller and stronger than both English and Belgian ones.
Okay, this came from a study where a Victorian researcher tested peasants from different countries on a weight machine. Yeah, I'd heard that before, and that's actually quite interesting.
And it was due to their diet. eating nutritious, vitamin-filled potatoes 3 meals a day.
Yep.
But in August of 1845, Irish farmers walked into their fields and smelled rot. The blight was in Ireland, but London had a plan to use this crisis to remake Ireland, a plan that would bring down Prime Minister Peel.
Yep. The Corn Laws.
London, September 12th, 1845. The press operator runs off issues of the Gardener's Chronicle. Over 6,000 copies, fresh and ready for tomorrow. The editor bursts in, waving a piece of paper. They must stop the presses and insert a front-page notice. No, it can't wait until next week. The potato blight has reached Ireland, the notice reads. Crops around Dublin are perishing. It ends with a question. Where will Ireland be in the event of a universal potato rot? But everyone knows where it will be, in the embrace of hunger. 2 months later, the Gardener's Chronicle was in the minority when it predicted agricultural disaster. Over the past 2 months, the press sent mixed signals. Some said the potato crop was fine. Others that the blight only affected a few counties. So to get a sense of the problem, Prime Minister Robert Peel sent a scientific commission to get solid numbers. Wait, pause the history for just a second. The Prime Minister's name during the potato famine was Peel. No one else thinks that's a little funny?
I do.
No, I know it's a
already
serious
said
story.
that.
Come on, stop looking at me like, fine, you know what, it's fine, it's fine. I'm sorry.
I'm with you.
His name's Peel, though.
Yes, it is.
Now, that commission was in the House of Commons, telling
All right. The commission advised a type of pit storage, but it was poorly described in the pamphlets that were only published in English. Yeah, the Irish peasants at this time, many were illiterate. A lot of those who could read were not fluent in English. They were speaking Irish, the native language. So that doesn't do a lot of good now, does it? And the pit system might work in some areas, but this is a water mold. As long as moisture can get down there, so can the mold. So the pit system isn't going to work in this particular situation, especially when there are going to be heavy rains involved.
Parliament to expect 80% mortality in the potato crop. They'd devised methods for keeping the blight away from harvested potatoes, but these proved ineffective. The news troubled Peel. In the summer, there had been hints of crop loss, but that was nothing new. Irish potatoes were unreliable. There'd been 16 potato failures since 1800, and when crops failed, tenants couldn't pay their rent. When tenants didn't pay, landlords brought police and troops to throw them off their land. That meant riots and retaliatory livestock killings. It would also mean secret societies like the Molly Maguires and White Boys ambushing landlords and middlemen in their carriages.
Okay, let's comment on this briefly. So he specifically mentions the Molly Maguires. Yes, they were active at this time in Ireland, but they weren't among the more prominent groups that were engaged in this kind of stuff. They would become better known in the United States and Pennsylvania later on in history. But there were groups like this. There were the Ribbon Men, for example. They typically didn't get too terribly violent, as in death or killings. It did happen, but that tended to be the exception, not the rule. More often was vandalism, threats. They were pretty common to leave notices or throw rock with notices on them that were warning the nobles or the elite or the law enforcement officials to cease and desist whatever they're doing that these people don't like. But there were examples like what they keep talking here. I just want to make it clear that this wasn't the primary means that they used. Typically, more often than not, you would see a little less violent action than this. But again, it did happen.
And those previous potato losses were only regional. This was the whole island. Instability worried Peel. A few years before, the Irish Member of Parliament, Daniel O'Connell, who had campaigned successfully against anti-Catholic laws, had set his sights on repealing the Act of Union. O'Connell's outdoor meetings had attracted 500,000 people. and the government had to threaten force to disperse them. Since then, Peel had taken a more conciliatory approach, but famine could upend everything. And the reports were bad. Now that it was November and the full harvests were coming in, the scope of the problem was becoming clear. Not even harvested potatoes were safe. In Western Ireland, a poor farmer had buried his...
Let's read this real quick. Pit storage didn't work, but the Commission's defense, they only had a month to study the blight and recommend a solution. All right, let's back up and continue.
Harvested potatoes were safe. In Western Ireland, a poor farmer had buried his harvested potatoes in a pit, muttering a prayer at how lucky he'd been. No blight. But a few days later, he opened the pit to check them. Half were totally rotten. Panic struck the whole west of Ireland, where the climate was too wet for grain or oats. I cannot describe in language strong enough, read one account, the frightful and awful alarm of the poor people. May God, in his bountiful mercy, avert such a disastrous calamity. Peel had his faults, but inaction was not one of them. The son of a textile industrialist, he was the first prime minister to come from business rather than the aristocracy. He'd risen through the civil service with sheer hard work and a few big gambles. And he was about to gamble again. Ireland would need food, but Peel would have to walk a fine line. He was a Tory, and his Conservative Party were hardcore trade protectionists, particularly due to support from grain merchants. Whatever he did, it couldn't undercut or upset the grain market. And then there was the opposition, the liberal Whigs. They were similarly hardcore when it came to free trade economics. They hated any government intervention in the market. So in other words, the Tories wouldn't support bringing in foreign grain because it would cut local merchants' profits, and the Whigs would shoot down any intervention on price.
Yeah, so this is what I was talking about earlier. This is where capitalism is going to make this particular famine worse. It's not the only factor, but it is going to be a big factor in multiple ways. And one way that it's a big factor is that on one hand, you got the laissez-faire capitalists who are saying, we do not interfere with the market no matter what happens. We let it run its course. It will fix everything. And then on the other hand, you have the people saying, you can't be importing cheaper American grain because American grain was cheaper. You're going to be undercutting our prices, and our British merchants are going to lose out. So they're putting economics ahead of humanitarianism.
Meanwhile, Daniel O'Connell and a Dublin group proposed their own measures. Forbid turning grain into whiskey, bring in foreign grains, institute public works, and stop exporting Irish grain, beef, and oats to England.
That's the big one, because during the Irish Potato Famine, they're growing more than enough food to feed all the Irish, more than enough. But a substantial portion of it is being exported to England, which leaves nothing for the Irish to eat. And again, this is an economic cause of the famine. The food's there, but they're sending it out of the country and letting these people starve.
Neither party, Peel knew, would stand for that. After all, grain imports were already a sensitive split, as the two parties consistently brawled over the Corn Laws, a series of protectionist measures meant to keep cheap American grain out of the UK. Oh, by the way, in Britain, corn means grain.
Right, and that comes from the Latin. It's just a catch-all corn for corn is a catch-all term for any kind of a grain product or grain. Yeah.
Got it? Cool.
Got it.
Peel had a plan to thread the needle, but it had to stay a secret. He sent an agent to Boston on a mission to buy 100,000 pounds worth of maize or cornmeal. Peel's agents then started shipping it to Ireland on the quiet.
Yep.
His bet was this: since maize didn't grow in Britain, and no British merchants traded in it, this wouldn't be a direct intervention in the market. But the shipments still had to be kept secret, or British merchants might freak out about the competition and withhold their shipments to Ireland.
Right, and there's other problems with this as well. I don't know if he'll get into it. All I'm going to say for now, and I might add more later if he doesn't talk about it, is that Ireland is not really in a position to utilize maize They don't have the facility to process maize into cornmeal, for example. It's never been in the Irish diet, so eating it actually can make them sick and ill. They don't know how to prepare it properly. So there's going to be a lot of problems associated with bringing in this unfamiliar grain for them to eat, and that's gonna cause problems. And not only is it gonna cause, well, let's just let him continue. I'll add more if I need to.
The plan wasn't to feed Ireland with cornmeal. It was that cheap cornmeal would keep food prices low. Maize would not be given away, but sold at cost to counties, and paid for by landlords who would fundraise through their own poor relief organizations. The government would then match those funds and deliver the cornmeal from regional food depots. Peel also instituted road building projects where people could earn a wage to buy the cornmeal. It would be revenue neutral. Ireland, he said, must feed Ireland. If that sounds like a convoluted bureaucratic nightmare to you, you are correct. The idea of fundraising was a particularly terrible one. It meant that the poorest counties got less food aid than the richer ones. Parish priests complained that no one in their county had anything to donate. If they could, they would have already bought food.
Yep.
Irish farmers ended up pawning their few possessions to buy cornmeal. Others had no choice but to sign up for the hard labor of working on the roads. There were logistical hurdles too. Irish infrastructure was dismal, with a minuscule railway network and roads that deteriorated outside major cities. Maize shipments had to navigate those rocky networks to reach rural areas. But even before that, the maize had to be ground into cornmeal, and Ireland only had 2 mills that could accomplish that. And even when people got the cornmeal, they had to learn to cook it properly or else it made them sick. Scurvy, previously unknown due to the potato's high vitamin C content, started cropping up.
Yeah, that's going to be another issue. That's a good point to make. Scurvy is caused by a deficiency in vitamin C. Potatoes have it, corn or maize does not. So, yeah, you're going to be vulnerable to scurvy if you're replacing potatoes with maize.
So people who couldn't get the relief food went hungry, and people who could plunged deeper into poverty, keeping themselves fed. Some even subsisted on spoiled potatoes. There were food riots and a few high-profile attacks on wealthy citizens. In one county, 1,500 Irish farmers turned up, all armed, when a group of British troops arrived to enforce an eviction. But overall, there was no major risings and no mass death. People survived. Peel, however, would not, because his maize and work programs were not the end of his plans. Though a Tory, he'd come around to the free trade views of the liberal Whigs. He disliked the Corn Laws, which kept cheap American grain off the British market, artificially inflating bread prices, and saw in the Irish crisis an opportunity to push for repeal. Now, if it helped Ireland, so much the better. But that was secondary. He would use this famine as a cudgel to beat his opponents with. He took on the Corn Laws, decrying how high tariffs contributed to starvation in Ireland. And he argued that greed, as much as blight, was starving the Irish farmer.
He wasn't wrong about that.
And this was explosive. In 1845, the Corn Laws conjured up the same emotional weight that surrounds issues like healthcare and fuel taxes today. Champions of the law predicted that repeal would collapse the agricultural sector, while the repeal camp cast images of a starving British public unable to afford bread. This move pushed Peel out as Prime Minister, but he was back 2 weeks later when the opposition failed to form a government. Long-term, repealing the Corn Laws would prove good for Britain. Cheap food helped fuel the expansion of its industrial base and build its empire, but it did nothing to help Ireland. In fact, by tying famine relief to the Corn Laws, he'd thrown the Irish poor into a partisan crossfire. Now, members of the pro-Corn Law camp doubted there even was a famine in Ireland. They spun conspiracy theories that Peel had embellished reports of blight in order to galvanize the repeal effort. And this theory gained credence when news emerged that the Scientific Commission had overestimated the 1845 crop loss. They had predicted an 80% mortality for the potato, but actually, the figure ended up being about half that. It was still a dire situation, sure, but not the agricultural apocalypse the scientists had sold Parliament. This ugly partisan warfare meant two things. First, an entrenched bloc in Parliament now saw famine relief as a partisan issue, tied to the Corn Laws. And second, it created an impression that reports of crop loss in Ireland were always exaggerated. But the truth boiled down to this. In the future, families would die with empty bellies in Ireland, while in London, politicians would dismiss reports of famine as alarmist. Peel won in the end. On June 29, 1846, as his cornmeal deliveries were finally in full swing, he crossed the aisle and voted with the opposition, repealing the Corn Laws once and for all. But he got to enjoy his victory for less than 24 hours, because the next day, both parties revolted and threw him out of power. The Whigs took over, high on their victory. And Peel's relief program, which had let the Irish poor barely scrape by through the first year of the crisis, came under the full control of a civil servant named Sir Charles Trevelyan.
And that is going to be really bad. Sir Charles Trevelyan is pretty vilified in Ireland, and for fairly decent reason. He takes a bad situation and he makes it worse. And not only does he make it worse, but he makes it worse for all the wrong reasons. In his own writings, he talked about how what's happening in Ireland is God's way of dealing with the laziness and the backwardness of the Irish people. He blames them for just being subhuman, basically. And he sees the famine as a righteous punishment from God. He is also a big follower of the teachings of Thomas Malthus. If you're not familiar with Malthus, he was a minister who wrote a treatise on basically on famine. He wrote a document talking about how famines are caused by the population exceeding the ability of the food supply to support it, the ability of the land to support the population. And he predicted that any time that famine, well, he basically stated, especially in his initial writings, that famine was nature's way of dealing with overpopulation. So once your population got too big for the land to support, everybody would die off and it would be brought back under control. It was a natural process. It was just nature's way of fixing a problem. And Trevelyan bought into all that. The problem is Ireland was producing more than enough food to feed the population. Like I said earlier, the problem was that they were shipping a lot of it off in the forms of exports, largely to pay their taxes and their rent and everything else like that. So it wasn't an issue of them not having the food. The issue was the food wasn't staying where it was needed to deal with this crisis. And Malthusianism, and in this case, religious prejudice and racial prejudice. Charles Trevelyan just basically considered the Irish certainly much less a human than he and his fellow Brits. And it's very clear in his writings that he felt that way. And he talked about how, for example, the system of farming is so backwards. What he doesn't discuss or maybe even doesn't realize is they are farming in the way that they've been forced to by the British. So it's a very hypocritical approach. He has been accused of genocide of the Irish people. And while I don't know, it depends on how you define genocide, I guess, he certainly contributed to the disaster in a significant way, in a major way. So he is vilified by the Irish, and pretty much rightfully so. Was he somebody who was out to kill them all out of maliciousness? No. Was he someone who felt that they were getting what they deserved and that we should just let nature and God run their course? Yes.
His first act was to...
The problem with that being he's the one that gets to decide what to do or not to do to fix this problem.
cancel the food shipments. After all, the task was done. Next year's crop was about to come in. But the 1846 crop was a total failure. And the bad times, the great hunger, were about to begin.
All right, we'll do this one and we'll be done for today.
July 1846. Ireland's early summer harvest is starting to come in. Reports of blight circulate, but in the east, summer has been temperate. The hunger might be over. Lightning rends the sky. Water drops like a guillotine. An unhealthy fog blankets the land, and upon seeing it, one fisherman tells a newspaper that it's the wrath of the fairies. I knew it by the signs they were coming. And perhaps he's not far off, because a tiny, malicious organism is riding the rain. The water washes fungus spores off the infected leaves, carrying it to the ground. And under the soil, the 1846 potato crop begins to decay. In January 1846, Daniel O'Connell had stood in Parliament and warned that Peel was not doing enough to fight the famine. There are 5 million people on the verge of starvation, he warned. And I'm speaking from the depth of my conviction when I say, I believe the result of neglect will be death to an enormous amount. Now, 8 months later, Peel was gone, and the government was doing even less. Hunger began pulling Ireland apart. Mothers starved until their milk gave out and their babies died. Men who had survived off food depots and public work projects found succor in neither. Orders had been given to food depots to preserve their grain until December. It didn't matter. People arrived at the depots on foot, shoeless, having not eaten in days. Depots relented and passed out cornmeal, but their reserves were getting low. Gangs of men carrying shovels marched into market towns demanding work. Food availability was not the problem. Amid the famine, bread sat in shop windows, and Irish merchants exported tons of beef, grain, and oats to England. The government refused to intervene, so, across the island, starving peasants did instead. In County Waterford, an armed militia blocked 2 barges that were transporting Irish grain for export. That done, they moved into the town, beating merchants, stealing bread, and lighting buildings afire. A unit of dragoons ordered them to disperse. When they didn't, the soldiers opened fire. 6 bodies lay in the street. Yet as Ireland reeled towards famine, in London, Sir Charles Trevelyan was retooling his relief plan to be less generous. Trevelyan was a legend in the civil service, incorruptible, pious, and hard-working. But he was also a workaholic micromanager, steeped in the Victorian belief that poverty was the sign of moral failure. To Trevelyan, the Irish problem, the fact that Ireland remained trapped in a cycle of poverty, violence, and rebellion, lay in the Irish character. They were lazy, rebellious, and took no initiative, he thought. Potato cultivation was too easy, only requiring a few months' labor a year, breeding idleness. And it was prone to failure. And when it failed, the Irish turned to government to feed them. Absent or neglectful Irish landowners shouldered little of the cost.
Yeah, and they shouldered a lot of the responsibility for the situation being the way it was. The Irish weren't cultivating primarily potatoes just because it was easy. They were doing it because it was the only thing they could actually successfully grow in sufficient quantities to keep themselves alive on what little land they were being allowed to keep for themselves. That's the entire issue.
And London feared that the Irish were becoming habitually dependent on government aid. To save Ireland, he thought, it needed modernization and agricultural reform. He dreamed of an anglicized Ireland, like the one that existed in its cities and market towns, one with English-style capitalism and a market economy, like theirs, to serve as a trade partner. He wanted to sweep out Ireland's communal village life and barter system, replacing it with a workforce that worked for wages rather than potatoes. One where they earned money to buy food. Trevelyan saw this blight not as a disaster, but a God-sent opportunity to remake Irish society.
Trevelyan believes staying at a distance from the suffering made him better at judging the situation dispassionately. Yeah, I can see where he's coming from with that, but it also means not necessarily understanding the size, the scope, and the impact of the situation if you're not there seeing it for yourself, especially when there is so much skepticism going on about how bad it really is. If you're not getting accurate and reliable reports, sometimes you need to see it up close firsthand I would argue you always do, but I can get the argument that you can judge dispassionately, but when thousands and then tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of people are dying, maybe you need a little passion. Just saying.
And he was determined to make the most of it, no matter how much suffering he had to inflict. Great guy. In fact, Trevelyan had studied under the economist Thomas Malthus,
Right.
who argued that when a population outstripped food production, starvation and death was a natural and proper correction. When Malthus put forth the theory, he was thinking of Ireland, and Trevelyan
True.
agreed. That belief in Malthusian principles, alongside a commitment to non-intervention in the free market, would plunge Ireland deep into famine. So when Trevelyan rolled out his reformed relief plan, it was no surprise that its primary mission was not to feed the starving, but instead to protect the free market, prevent abuse, and teach economic lessons. When food depots reopened, the poor found that the cornmeal was no longer sold at cost. That, argued Trevelyan, undercut local merchants. Now it was market price. All food depots would close, except those in the West. And Trevelyan insisted that any maize purchased come from British merchants.
Let's continue this. Let's read what he says here. The government could buy American maize and grain, but only through British purchasing agents and shippers. Yay. So yeah, he's taking a bad situation and he's doing basically everything he can to make it worse. And by tying it to the market system, he's opening the door to one of the most common problems in modern post-capitalism famines, which is price gouging, which is hoarding. So if you're going to rely on the market system and you're going to have a policy of hands-off, that really creates an environment where you can get people taking advantage of it. Stockpiling food, selling it way above cost because people are desperate. We see this every time there is any kind of a large-scale disaster. We saw it in different forms, for example, in the COVID-19 pandemic. We've all remember the stories of people hoarding toilet paper, for example. Same basic concept. And it's not just that. You can see this same thing happening in famines and pandemics throughout history. But especially under capitalism, because the free market system really kind of lends itself to this. But you do see the same thing in, for example, the Holodomor. That's one of the reasons why you had the persecution of the kulaks in Ukraine. The kulaks were being portrayed by the government as price gougers, as people who were merchants and wealthier members of society that were taking advantage of it to buy up the cheap grain and then resell it at much higher prices to benefit themselves at the expense of the people who were literally starving to death. Even earlier, you'll see it even in like the 1601 to 1603 famine in Russia. There were people they called the Lopians that were basically the same kind of a thing. They were people who were buying up food and then reselling it at marked up prices to benefit at the expense of people who are literally starving to death. In fact, working on my thesis, I've read some court cases where people were accusing Lopians of being sorcerers and witches, which is also kind of a thing that happens a lot in this kind of situation. So this is not uncommon, and he's opening the door to this by embracing a hands-off free market society solution, I should say. Sometimes you need government to step in and prevent price gouging, to prevent hoarding, because hoarding is going to make this worse because it makes, obviously, the food scarcer. Prices are going to go up. It's just a disaster.
Not American ones. When the public works began again, job seekers discovered their new wages were based on performance rather than a flat daily fee, and even the highest wages couldn't feed a family. The wages themselves were supposedly funded via attacks on Irish landlords, but many landlords had little to spare. And due to multiple levels of bureaucracy meant to prevent fraud, the road crew's wages often took weeks to arrive. And finally, there would be no intervention in food prices. Laissez-faire economics would rule. High prices, Trevelyan argued, would attract food imports. But, you guessed it, they didn't.
No.
In fact, food prices had soared higher than ever. It had been a bad year for agriculture, and not just in Ireland. Crops failed across Europe. Countries scrambled to import extra food, and Trevelyan was late to refill his cornmeal. So by the time he grudgingly started looking, there was little to be had. And in Ireland, potato and cornmeal prices doubled. At government food depots, hungry people arrived from miles away, only to find the maize unaffordable. Across the island, small farmers and landless agricultural workers were plunged into immediate destitution. They surged into market towns to beg for food at depots, and they even began entering the hated workhouses.
So let's talk about migration. This is kind of the first wave of migration, and you'll see this a lot in famine. And that is the migration of rural people to the more populated areas, which sometimes it might sound a little counterintuitive. If you're suffering from food shortages and food loss, wouldn't you want to stay on a farm where food was being produced rather than going to cities where they had to bring them in? But the reality is that in famines, typically you'll see if they get to a certain stage, you'll start seeing people heading to the larger cities. They're hoping to find jobs. They're hoping to find they assume that all this food is going into the cities, which it is, but these cities aren't designed to handle this huge influx that's coming in. And you see this in multiple countries in multiple periods of time. And you see it here in Ireland. People are leaving the farms and heading into the cities. Well, that's certainly not going to be helping the situation either now, is it? You got less people growing the food, you're going to have less food. Less food means scarcity. Scarcity means not only are you not have as much to eat, but the prices are going to go up, making the situation just escalate that much further. Really, really a difficult situation. And especially in this particular famine, everything that they're trying to do in the first couple of years is almost always making it worse. Now, they're going to start fixing it a little bit later, but too little, too late. One other thing I'm going to toss in right here while we're here, let's talk about the church, or the churches, because in Ireland, we got both the Protestants and the Catholics. 80% of the Irish that are being affected by this famine are going to be Catholic, give or take a little bit. The Catholic Church is stretched to the breaking point during this crisis. A lot of their priests are dying because I mentioned it earlier. Famine tends to bring strong disease. These priests are going from household to household, village to village, or they're gathering people for services. All of this is encouraging or creating a situation where these priests are being exposed to diseases. They're being overworked. Priests who were way too old, that were you didn't typically retire, but you would take on easier tasks within the church or community. These guys were now coming out of seclusion and being forced to work far beyond their endurance. So the Catholic Church was taking a huge hit. Some parishes were really, really struggling just to have a priest. And this was terrifying people, because the Catholics, if you don't have those last rites, you're in trouble. You are potentially going to be damned. And speaking of that, let's talk about the Protestants. The Protestant churches did try to help to some degree, but a lot of time their help was contingent on conversion. So if a Protestant minister was setting up, for example, a soup kitchen or any other kind of relief effort, it would be contingent on conversion. And that also created a lot of tension, Because again, for a devout Catholic, conversion may very well be the same as damning yourself. You are abandoning your faith to go over to another one that isn't going to give you the correct, proper rites and blessings and ceremonies, including your last rites. So it's literally a situation of damned if you do, damned if you don't. You're going to die if you don't convert. It's literally convert or else in that. So it's really a bad situation. There's not going to be enough coffins made during this period to handle the dead. There is going to be mass burials. There are going to be some areas where they're using reusable coffins designed so you can put the body in them, move them over to the grave to give them a little bit of dignity, but once they're over the grave, there's just a catch that you open and it dumps the body in the grave, and then you reuse the casket for the next guy. Just a horrible situation any way you look at it.
A government poor relief program best described as a prison for the poor, where they lived while performing mindless work in exchange for 2 meals a day. And workhouses were abusive and inhumane by design, so the poor would only enter as a last resort. Yet even they were over capacity.
Yeah, and a lot of people literally would rather die than work in these workhouses because they were that miserable. By design, as he said. And in fact, if you think of, if you're familiar with Charles Dickens and the Christmas Carol, right in the beginning, you have that scene where Scrooge confronts some folks collecting alms for the poor, and they ask him to donate, to help feed the poor, and Scrooge confronts them by asking them, do I not pay taxes to build workhouses for these people? And the answer is, well, yes. Well, then they must go there. Well, some would rather die than go there. Well, then they'd better go ahead and be done with it and reduce the surplus population. He said something to that effect. That is literally Malthusian principles in action. And I'm fairly sure that's what inspired Dickens to include that line. They'd better just go ahead and die and reduce the surplus population. And yeah, the poorhouses and the workhouses were literally that bad. A lot of people would rather die than go there. A lot of people would rather go to jail than go to the workhouses. Some people would deliberately commit crimes in order to be put in jail, and they would not be happy if they weren't being exiled to, for example, Australia. That was that, especially later on, that becomes a goal. Get arrested and get sentenced to deportment, to transport was what it was called, to be sent typically to Australia. Some people actually kept committing crimes in order to eventually get that sentence.
Despite the people's desperation, landlords upped the eviction rate, calling in police and soldiers to throw families out and demolish their homes with the sledgehammer and crowbar. Tenants killed livestock in retribution, and on occasion, ambushed and murdered landlords. Evicted families wandered the roads, pitching tents in ditches. Crime rates doubled. This was the season of the gunman. And it wasn't just the small tenant farmers and landless laborers showing up at the food depots.
Let's see what he says here. Trevelyan once reprimanded a Coast Guard captain for distributing aid to starving people without orders.
Managers reported small landowners, 10 to 15 acremen, approaching them to request aid, fine clothes hanging off their skeletal frames. One had even walked 12 miles to an unfamiliar town rather than reveal to his neighbors that he'd gone bankrupt. Blight compounded everything. In small farms, barley rotted in the field. Usually farmers paid laborers to harvest, but they had neither money nor potatoes to offer. And as if that wasn't enough, that winter, a series of blizzards ravaged the island, snow stacking to the rooftops, entombing whole villages. Soon, the new year dawned on what would be known as Black 47. January brought a strange frenzy. Families, hollow-eyed and losing hair, stumbled to the shore to eat seaweed and oysters. They scaled 300-foot cliffs just to steal bird eggs. They could have survived off fish, but they had neither the equipment, boats, nor skill for deep water fishing. And by that time, most of the fishermen had pawned their nets for cornmeal. Armed gangs ambushed government food convoys and butchered stolen cattle to survive. By the end of January, 700,000 had turned to working on public works. These famine roads were often a waste. They started nowhere and went nowhere. Malnourished work gangs broke rocks in freezing temperatures. Their shoes and coats long ago lost to the pawn shop.
Ireland had serious infrastructure issues. He already mentioned that earlier. They have an opportunity here to fix that, but instead they're wasting this opportunity to make pointless roads just to make work, just to make these people as miserable as possible. It just boggles my mind. They really could have done what we did in the Great Depression here in the United States with the Civilian Conservation Corps. They built a lot of very useful roads to places that needed them. The same thing could have been done here, but they wasted that opportunity.
Shop. And they died there, in great numbers,
They did.
collapsing beside the roads from exhaustion. Violence against public works managers became so pervasive that many deserted their posts, while others, laden with guilt, ended their own lives. In a famine, it's not the starvation that kills you, it's the diseases that follow. Typhus, dysentery, fever, and the famine dropsy. Peasants
Yeah, and during this period, by the way, there was also a cholera epidemic going all the way through Europe, so that's going to hit too.
fleeing the countryside carried them into cities, and infection ran so rampant in workhouses, the staff began to quit. Visitors and officials reported seeing villages where the want was so extreme that families lacked the energy to even bury their dead. The Irish funeral, so embodied in the culture, disappeared piece by piece. No one wanted to gather for fear of the fevers. None could afford a coffin, and eventually, even individual graves were dispensed with. Dogs scavenged the burial fields. Amid that landscape of horror, one place stood out as particularly destitute. Skibbereen, in County Cork, became internationally famous for its deplorable conditions. Drought exacerbated the famine, and after a few months, the frantic scramble to survive had passed, leaving only a lethargic wait for the grave. Families crawled across their cabins, too weak to even walk, and a visiting American found himself in a surreal conversation with two young women, as they casually calculated how many days they had left to live. 14, they agreed. Accounts from Skibbereen made the village internationally famous, the face of the Great Hunger, and its ghoulish tales, repeated in newspapers, inspired people around the globe to raise money for famine relief. Donations came from as far away as Australia, and in the United States, even enslaved people and Native Americans raised funds for Ireland.
Yeah, famously the Choctaws, who were just fresh off of their own version of the Trail of Tears, raised something like around $150, I believe, that they sent to help feed the Irish. And the Irish never forgot that. They built a monument to the Choctaw because of this gift. And in the 2020 pandemic, they even helped provide relief for, I believe, the Navajo and one other tribe, I don't remember which one. And they specifically stated that this was paying forward the debt that they owed to the Choctaw for their support during the famine. So this was a very meaningful thing for the Irish people. Every little bit helped. And to this day, they are known for showing their appreciation, not just to the Choctaw, but I believe Ireland has in recent years been one of the top sources of food aid around the world.
The international outcry finally pushed Trevelyan to act. For months, he'd downplayed the increasingly urgent and alarming reports from his own officers on the ground, even when they'd rebelled against his policies, selling cornmeal at cost or serving free meals at workhouses. He relented. The British government would support outdoor relief, the opening of soup kitchens and free meal distribution. But it was too little, too late. Deep famine had already affected the planting season, and the next crop would be poor. Many Irish decided they only had two options: either fight for Ireland or leave it.
All right, we'll stop here. Oh no, not the American wake. Okay, I'm familiar with that term. I'm not looking forward to part 4. It's gonna be depressing. The other thing I wanted to add before we leave is one of the reasons that this famine gets progressively worse, and this isn't true just of this famine, but of a lot of famines that are multi-year. Again, I think of the 1601-1603 famine in Russia, as well as the 1921-22 famine in Russia, is because people were starving in the first year, or even the first 2 years in some cases. They eat everything, including the seed crop. And in the case of Ireland, they're going to eat a lot of the seed potatoes, which means they've got nothing to plant for the next year, or less to plant for the next year. Sometimes a short-term fix, I need to live today, sets them up for long-term issues or problems, and that's a good example of that. Seed potatoes, or just seeds in general, seed crops, often are casualties of famine, which even if the blight were to go away next year, they don't have anything left to plant. So that's another thing you got to take into account when you're looking at major famines like this. And it's one of those temptations you have to try your best to resist, because you do need to be able to plant them again. Anyway, we'll pick up here next time. I'm not looking forward to talking about the American wake. Bring your tissues. But yeah, now we're going to get into the emigration, the Great Flight from Ireland. And I will see you there next time. Until then, see you later. Bye-bye.